Well, thank you for joining us today. Let's have you state your names for the record, starting at the back table to my left, your right, sir.
Good afternoon, Senator. My name is Tom Yowell. I'm the Chief Administration and Disbursements Division.
Thank you, Mr. Yowell.
Good afternoon, Senator. I'm Jan Ross. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the State Controller's Office.
Good afternoon, Senator. I'm Lisa Crow. I have responsibility for Personnel and Payroll Services at the State Controller's Office.
Good afternoon, Tony Davidson, Project Director.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. Sir.
Hi, Jim Lombard, Chief Administrative Officer and Executive Sponsor for the project.
Thank you for being here. Who is going to present first, if anyone?
I am, Senator.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Certainly. We could start with Mr. Lombard.
I've been on for about 6 years now.
I came to this project in March of 2012.
That's Mr. Davis.
This month.
Lisa?
I came to work for the State Controller's Office to run payroll in January of 2010, so a little over 3 years.
Ms. Ross?
I've been with the State Controller's Office since August 2006. I was not a part of the project. I have responsibility for the legacy systems, although I was an external stakeholder in the governance model.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I've been with the department for 8 years, since 2005. And I also am an external stakeholder. I run the disbursements area that makes the pays.
Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Lombard.
Yes, thank you, sir. I want to talk a little bit about how we got to go live, and then what happened after we went live with the system. Talk about what happened afterwards, our post-termination efforts. Senator, you asked us in Budget Sub 4 what went right, what went wrong. I want to share those lessons with you, and then talk a little bit about what our next steps are. So in getting to go live, after we cured and solved our data conversion problems, the new schedule counted for a pilot project in June 2012. We completed 109 project deliverables getting to that point. We conducted 26 tests, and over 4,600 test scripts were executed. At the time we went live, we expected payroll to be accurate within $1, except for known differences. When our payroll comparison test 3, the independent verification and validation, those are folks on the project that look at how things are going, said there were no significant findings with payroll comparison test 3. We had a master readiness task list, and I want to apologize, Senator, if I use jargon in terms that are kind of computer tech related. Please stop us if we do that, and we can try and explain it. But we had a number of tasks. We had 11 entities and project stakeholders that were watching these task lists. We had over 300 tasks. When we went live, we only had a couple that were red because the schedule was a little bit behind, and because of our small population, we had workaround issues for those items, and so it wasn't problematic. We have independent, as I said, verification and validation, and independent project oversight, both that report to the technology agency. And IB&V stated that there were no issues so significant that anyone would have recommended not going live. Our project teams, stakeholders, special business partners, and project dividers, and SAP all recommended go live to our steering committee. And in May 2012, our executive steering committee approved going live. We went live in June 2012. In July, we started noticing a significant number of errors. There were people that were getting paid for vacation, people getting not being paid for disability, and we identified a number of issues in July. In August, SAP executives brought in some escalation teams to assist in, they told us that we'll look at your problems in the system, come up with root causes, and get you back on track. We worked with them for months. We were unable to come to resolution with them, so we issued our cure letter in October. In November, they responded saying that there was a denial that there were any problems with the system, and they had no intention to cure the issues. In February, we terminated SAP. Since then, we rolled our SCO employees, 1,400 of them, back to our legacy system, and we began efforts to reconcile their pay. This has been a significant challenge. The pay, as we didn't discuss before, but it's a very complicated process. And we've also reduced project staff by about 100 folks. So what went right? We had a mature governance structure. We had followed best practices and industry standards related to project management, and we had formal governance with 4 levels of oversight and 9 management components. I think we identified critical system defects in Pilot 1 and stopped deployment, thereby preventing an impact to additional employees. We also used a gate-like approach to ensure that risk was contained and that key foundational activities were completed before advancing. So what went wrong, Senator? One of the issues that we found was that we lacked certain contract tools to assist in managing the vendor. And because of our concern that we would lose competition in procurement, those tools were not included in the contract, and we believe that those would be useful in focusing, a vendor's performance. We used Public Contract Code 6611 procurement. There were guidelines in place, but they were not for IT projects. We were the first entity to actually use this negotiation process for procurement for a large IT project, and guidelines are now in place to assist with future procurements. The contract payment structure is not designed to align state and vendor goals. We had a number of deliverables, and we should have had more performance measures tied to those. So that's at least something we'll consider in the future, is to restructure payments so they're tied to system progress. SAP's testing methodology was inadequate. I think one of the lessons learned is to require a skilled, independent party to design and execute and validate sufficient testing. SAP couldn't keep pace with fixing the problems, the defects that we had in the system. They informed the state that they'd gathered a couple hundred pages of findings and would not share. So this gets to one of the issues that Carlos, the Secretary for Technology, raised. And, we believe that it would have been beneficial for us to have a red team, a team to bring in at the time we were having problems to assist. We didn't have a operations framework delivered by SAP. That was problematic, and the blueprint validation process proved to be insufficient to design a system to produce accurate paychecks. SAP failed to deliver the staffing needed to successfully deliver the project. The state needs additional means to ensure the vendor provides the level and quality of staffing that's proposed in its bid. I think we relied heavily on SAP's representations about its qualifications and unique expertise in areas requiring, special COTS software. I think that SAP underestimated the size and complexity of California's payroll with 160 agencies and 21 bargaining units. The payroll system was unstable. It had material errors and defects, and the contractor couldn't fix those defects or determine the root cause or create a corrective action plan that we felt we could move forward to Pilot 2. Combination of all these factors prevented success, and ultimately SCO had no option but to terminate SAP for its lack of performance. So what are the next steps for us? We're working on completing the payroll reconciliation efforts. We're working on supporting the state's legal interests. We want to begin an independent assessment to determine what's salvageable, business process changes that may be necessary for the state, and other factors. And we also want to reduce MyCalPay's maintenance costs. So with that, Senator.
Anyone else want to say anything? Well, I have some questions, and I've tried to go through the various reports that were presented to us. I didn't do individual interviews with folks, so, I have to read what I'm given, and as a result, I have some questions. And I'd sort of like to go back to the beginning, and you may or may not be able to answer this, and if not, I understand. But when we set out on this path almost 8 years ago anyway, 9 years ago, 2004, 2005. Did the Comptroller's Office benchmark any other payroll systems in any other states to see what was best? And if so, what was the best state, and what did we do about that?
Senator Tony Davidson. I can tell you, I haven't seen the information, but I asked those same questions when I came on board. And there was research done in other states before the procurement of the software. They looked around and saw what was available. And there are a number of states, for example, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Kentucky, I believe, are all on SAP platforms. But when they acquired the software, it was an open competition. The bid came down between, there's a few companies looking initially, and it came down to two bidders at the end, Lawson Software and SAP. And based on the criteria of the initial procurement, the SAP software one was procured.
And in asking this series of questions, and I have a few, one of the things that I'm looking at is legislative fixes. And we've been talking generically. You spoke generically about contract fixes in Section 6611. Your report talks generically about contract and procurement fixes. And I'm actually trying to ferret out what the detail is and what the specific fix is, because that's how we operate up here. We have to know specifically what the problem is, what should have been available, so we can craft legislation to make that available to future agencies in delving into these procurement projects. So I gather somebody took a look at the states, but there wasn't a best practices identified in a particular state. And if there was, we're saying the procurement process in California dictated that we take the lowest responsible bidder, whether or not that software worked in Maine or New Hampshire or Texas or not.
Yeah, and forgive me, Senator, I don't recall if in the COTS package it was the lowest responsible bidder. On the system integration, it was a best value bid. So it was separated out 60% of the points for the business technical requirements and 40% cost. And honestly, I can't recall if that did apply to the software itself. But California, again, along the lines of competition, had decided to bifurcate the procurement between software and services, and at the time the thinking was they would get more competition that way. And typically what had been seen at or about the time is a software company has a preferred service provider, and they would bid together, thus precluding other service providers for bidding with that software. So the rationale at the time was to bid by the software and then by the services that go with it. So we decided at some point to go with off-the-shelf software, which ties into a question I asked. I'll still call him the secretary, on customization versus off-the-shelf. And I saw some reference in someone's report about the legal and collective bargaining framework in California, which somehow suggested that our system was very, very complex. So if the system here in California is so complex, why did we go with an off-the-shelf software package? Yeah, that's a good question, Senator. At the time when they did the evaluation, when you look back to the procurement, SAP looked at some 552 business requirements, and at the time said that they fit within the COTS platform.
But do we have capability, an organic capability in the state of California to do our own assessment of those issues? Or do we always have to rely on, the outside contractor or the potential contractor to come in and tell us whether their software package off the shelf will fit our requirements?
I think to a large degree we have to rely on the outside vendor. What the state and what SEO specifically understands is its business requirements. We don't necessarily understand or experts in all the softwares that are out there in the market. So to a large degree it is dependent upon the vendor looking at the requirement and saying, my software will fit this requirement. And oftentimes it isn't until you get into detailed discussion about that when you find out something, that an assumption was made here that, doesn't necessarily hold true.
It's a little bit bothersome in the sense that as the purchasing entity, the state of California, we can't apparently do our own evaluation of the product or the responsible, contractor in the sense of being able to satisfy that's not a criticism of you, but I'm just commenting on the state of California, apparently. We rely on the vendor to tell us whether they can do the job when we set out specifications in the contract as to what the product is that we want to purchase, and we say, can you provide it? And if they say yes, I guess that's the end of the conversation. There seems to be some disagreement as to how many changes were actually agreed to or approved on this off-the-shelf software. I've seen numbers in the neighborhood of 280 changes that were agreed upon and 300 and something that were requested total. I saw some other number that was 125. But there were a lot of changes to this off-the-shelf software. You'd agree to that?
There were a number of changes, yes.
Well, then let me ask my other sort of preliminary question on the selection of the contractor. And you may not be able to answer this, but let me ask it anyway. What due diligence was done when we identify, it's through some process, SAP as the vendor that we're going to go to? And I have a similar question for Bearing Point, but SAP is the vendor that we're going to go to purchase this off-the-shelf software to do our payroll. Was there any sort of questioning of SAP's prior customers or clients in terms of who you've done work for, what the size of the projects were? Were you sort of kicked off the job? Were you successful? Those sorts of questions that normal folks would ask, but we may not be able to ask in the state of California. So
are you asking specifically because there's two procurements involving SAP? Software?
Let's deal with software first.
And then for service.
I'm doing it chronologically, okay. So I'm focused in 405, right?
So
on software.
It's been a long time. I did look at the software procurement again. That was around 2004, 2005. I'm going to answer typically. Typically, there's an administrative section where those kinds of questions are asked. Those are formulated typically by general services, wanting to know qualifications about the company, right? And then the business-related requirements are typically driven by the customer, which in this instance would be the controller's office, listing out the number of requirements. But in terms of vetting the company itself, those are typically in administrative requirements, primarily driven by general services.
Do we know in this particular case, I realize we're doing historical self-assessment here, do we know whether or not there were any, whether it was done with SAP as the off-the-shelf vendor, and or whether there were any deficiencies uncovered?
I'd have to go back on the software procurement itself. I'd have to go back and look at that. I'm pretty sure I know the answers as you move forward on the timeline for the services ones, but not on the COTS procurement.
Well, certainly as we do our self-assessment, and hopefully we won't do it here in a public hearing, you all do it someplace else largely, but as we do that, I hope somebody looks at that, because if there is a statutory impediment to government agencies doing the requisite amount of due diligence prior to entering into these contracts, I think we need, as a legislature, and I don't speak for the administration, but I suspect they would agree we need to take a look at that and give agencies the tools that the agencies need to properly investigate contractors before we spend a bunch of money on them. So that would be great if you could take a look at that.
Okay, I will certainly follow up on that.
Well, then there was this other issue that sort of popped out at me as I was reviewing these reports, and that had to do with some commotion down in Los Angeles, both with the community college district and with a unified school district, both having to deal with SAP. And I believe in the LA Community College District in or about July of 2005, that had to do with SAP as a software vendor, not an integrator. Are you familiar with that set of circumstances? Anyone?
I am familiar at a high level, yes.
And SAP was just a software vendor at that point?
That's my understanding, yes. And Deloitte, I believe, was the system integrator.
Now, as we were moving forward with the SAP procurement in California, did the agency did the controller's office, I should say, do any due diligence with respect to the LA Community College District issues with SAP as a software vendor?
Yes, in fact, they did. They had met with them and discussed some of the issues that happened in LAUSD. Can
you be specific with us as to what problems were identified by the controller's office team associated with that community college district program?
Excuse me. I reviewed the meeting minutes from the meeting, and it was discussion about it. The takeaway from that was one thing that they had done. Well, actually, a couple of things. LAUSD had done what's a big bang implementation, meaning that they brought all of their users on concurrently at the same time. And that's highly risky. And it's highly risky because, again, if you have any problems, it's not contained to a very small population. Everybody's impacted at the same time. That was one of the big lessons learned that came out of LAUSD for everyone involved in all software projects. Secondarily, I think we had looked at, the governance that they had, and one of the recommendations that was made internally from the controller's office was to strengthen their steering committee going forward. So I believe at or about that time, a number of the power agencies, as their terms, were added to the executive steering committee. And then I believe lastly, based on the scope of what was looked at going forward, that the California State University was then excluded from the scope of it, just to mitigate risk, again, to kind of reduce the scope of the overall implementation. I believe those were the three key points, and Jim, feel free to correct me if you remember something I don't.
That's, we also to reduce complexity of our system, we put off implementing employee self-service. We put that out to a future wave when we would bring CSU on board.
Well, at the community college district, were there any issues associated with taking an off-the-shelf product such as SAPs and customizing it to the district's operation?
I'm not familiar with the actual details of what the problems were at LAUSD. I do know that they applied population-wide, and it took some time to resolve those.
As a result, now, at the same time, did you also do the inquiry, the team inquiry at LA Unified School District that was also attempting to implement SAP software?
With the services team? Is that
right?
Is that what you're
the lessons learned team, I think somebody referred to it in the report.
I don't believe, if you're asking if they met with Deloitte, the system integrator, I don't believe our folks met with them. I think they just met with the client at LAUSD. And I'm working from recollection from looking at notes.
At LAUSD, what problems were identified by the lessons learned team? Can you recall?
I'm trying to remember. I could go back and look at the meeting minutes, and I don't think that they had lessons learned. And I think at the point in time that our folks met with their folks, I think they discussed some of the problems, but I don't think they were at the point where they actually had lessons learned. The lessons learned that SCO took away, again, was reduce the size of the project, make sure that you don't do a big bang approach to the entire population, and incorporate a stronger executive steering committee.
Was there any written report prepared by the lessons learned team, either as a result of the visit with the Community College District or LA Unified School District regarding the SAP software implementation?
We searched and searched, and we could find no written report.
Were there any proposed contract provisions proposed or implemented with respect to our SAP software or systems integrator procurement as a result of the Community College District visit or the LA Unified School District visit?
I believe that in the scope of work, what we were looking at was detailing or narrowing this down to exclude the CSU population, because again, I believe there's some nuances in the school sector that created some difficulties at LAUSD. So by excluding CSU, would have moved some of that out. And again, State Controller's Office was focused on a pilot, and then a second pilot, and then a three-waved implementation, so as to avoid the problems associated with the Big Bang. That way, if a problem did come out, it could be contained before it went to the larger population.
Now, one of the reports that I had an opportunity to review also references a blow-up with regard to an SAP system at the Irish Health System sometime also in 2005. Was that anything that the Controller's Office became aware of as we were moving through this procurement process?
I'm not familiar with Irish Health. It may have been something I looked at researching afterwards, Jim. I don't know. If
I don't recall.
I don't recall.
Well, let's turn to the procurement involving the systems integrator, which was Bearing Point, correct? And that was sometime in 2006, June or so of 2006, correct?
I believe so.
What due diligence did we do with respect to Bearing Point as to whether or not Bearing Point had any prior experience as a systems integrator, whether Bearing Point had any prior involvement with SAP software? Was there any sort of due diligence at all, or did we just give the contract?
Senator, there was, and I would have to go back and look at that procurement. I have looked at it recently, and when I say recently, I would say within the past 4 or 5 months. And again, typically, there's an administrative requirements section that asks a lot of questions about your company and your qualifications, and then client references as to where you have successfully implemented before. I do know that I have looked at those. I don't have them. I can't reach back and grab them in memory. I do believe that due diligence was done in accordance with the administrative requirements.
Well, I guess I have 2 questions. I realize your look is a hindsight type look, but in looking at it in terms of hindsight, were there any red flags that jumped out at you, that any issues where we should have done more due diligence as a state, either with Bearing Point or SAP, with regard to the software procurement or the systems integrator contract?
With Bearing Point, I can't recall any issues that jumped out, no.
Well, were there any statutory impediments that precluded the Controller's Office, in this case, from doing the sort of due diligence that we would want to do to find out if someone had prior experience with SAP software, whether someone had prior experience as a systems integrator, whether there were successes and failures and that sort of similar information?
I don't believe that there's any statutory impediments in the bake-off procurement that was used under 6611. That had never been used for IT procurement before, so there was a lack of guidelines there. But I don't think anything necessarily prevented folks from doing what they needed in terms of due diligence. And I think folks followed the outline that DGS laid out in the procurement, which typically followed what they do is, administrative requirements and then company qualifications and then, client references in terms of, where have you deployed software on a similar size and scale. And those were included in the procurement.
Well, we've spoken, or others have spoken about Public Contract Code Section 6611 and the DGS guidance. What changes do we need to make to that on a go-forward basis, that section or that guidance, to avoid this problem in the future?
So I am aware that DGS has created guidelines since this initial procurement. I have not looked at those recently. And from my knowledge of just procurement in general, I'd say that they just need to be clear about interactions with potential bidders. It seemed as when the SCO went through that there may have been a pull or a contention between perceived fairness and the state being able to do a deep dive and get to the kind of information that it needed.
So, I mean, is it I'm just trying to find out.
Sure.
Just a simple guy here. Is it the controller's view that 6611, as it existed at the time in 2004, 5, 6, 7, even today, interferes with a California agency's ability to reach out, ask the right questions, to weed out contractors that promise the moon and deliver zero?
I don't think that interferes with it, and I don't think that's the controller's position. 6611 was used here. It was innovative thinking, and it actually accomplished one of the goals that it was trying to achieve. Was, given the fact that there was a stalled project on the sideline, and it's hemorrhaging money with a large project staff, they're trying to complete a procurement in a relatively tight time frame. Typically, a procurement of this nature would take 18 to 24 months in California. And they set out under 6611 to get it done within about 10 or 11 months. And I think from RFP issuance to contract signing, I think it was 13 months. And for a procurement of this nature and this size, that's quite a big accomplishment. So I think there were some challenges along the way. I think that California is certainly learning, especially with these guidelines in place, about the areas that they need to do probably a little more digging about vendors.
Well, so I'm going to ask it a different way, because obviously, I'm all about process improvement here and on our watch, trying not to have this happen again. Is there anything that you would change in the operating framework, the framework in terms of IT procurement and the controller's experience, that would have avoided the situation that we ultimately had, which is a failure of at the procurement phase? The failure we had, which was a failure of apparently the SAP software implementation, the systems integrator performance on multiple occasions, and the like. Is that a fair question?
I think that's a fair question.
So in other words, is there anything that you would have changed, or the controller's office would have changed if you could have, at the point of procurement, that would have caused you or helped you identify potential performance deficiencies in the bidders on the contract?
Yeah, and of course, this is all with hindsight glasses on, right?
We're all operating there.
I think looking backwards that, there's one of the things I referred to a couple times is the administrative section where DGS typically asks companies about, what they do and what they've done. There's a section in there related to, do you have a lawsuit pending? Have you ever been this, that, or do you have, I think that's it. Do you have a lawsuit, outstanding or pending? That's typically asked to vet the company's solvency with regard to their financials. DGS wants to know, hey, is there something out there that we get halfway through this project that is so big it's going to tank the company, right? And the question is materiality. How big does a project have to be for somebody to report that in their 10K? For corporations, that's where it goes, and that's where the answer is typically answered. So it would have to be for a $4 billion company, a terminated contract and a potential lawsuit would have to be enormous to be material. I think a question very similar to that should be asked, but about how they do business, not in terms of trying to vet their their financial solvency, but to vet how do they do business. So, for example, take that question, you flip it around a little bit. In the last 5 years, please tell me everywhere where you've either had a penalty associated with a contract like this, where you've been terminated, where you settled out, and you go down the list. I think that would tell more telling information about how the company operates with its clients than the focus on just the financial.
Because in this case, we know that neither, I think I'm correct me if I'm wrong, we know that neither the Community College District in LA nor the Unified School District were able to implement the SAP system. Am I right?
I believe they finally implemented it down at LAUSD.
LAUSD. Yeah. Community College pulled the plug.
I'm not sure which one. I believe LAUSD has implemented it.
Okay. Well, let's move forward, and we'll talk about Bearing Point in a minute. In looking through the documentation, we're in the contract phase now with SAP, with the software and Bearing Point as the systems integrator. There were more than a few independent project oversight committee or consultant reports that warned of staffing deficiencies in the controller's office critical positions. And I didn't see much, I don't think, in the way of staffing issues in the controller's preliminary review. Perhaps I overlooked them, which is possible. But were there issues with respect to staffing in critical positions that impacted the implementation of this SAP project?
You're asking during the Bearing Point?
Well, we can talk about 2006, 2007, yes.
I can't really comment. Maybe some of the other team could comment during the Bearing Point phase. I can address certainly staffing during when SAP was here as a system integrator.
Okay. Can you be more specific or be specific as to the problems that you were having with Bearing Point as a systems integrator in the 2006-2007 timeframe?
I don't recall specifically. I know we were having challenge with them performing. I really wasn't involved in the project much at that point in time.
We do know ultimately they were terminated for failing to roll out a data conversion platform or program that worked, right?
Correct.
Okay. Did the controller's office do any lessons learned analysis after the Bearing Point failure?
Some of those, Senator, again, we tried to reduce the complexity of the project, and we reduced the scope of the project. We reduced the CSU out of the project, and we reduced employee self-service as well. We also implemented stronger governance models, things like that.
But, and I think part of it really related to when you look at the bake-off procurement under the 6611, that was really designed to bring in, to qualify companies and bring them into the stage one process, which was to allow them to look at the Bearing Point artifacts that were created to date. It was SAP and Accenture, and they were each paid $500,000 to come in and to look at the project artifacts and what had gone on, what is reusable, in order to help them perfect their bid. And so I think it's not, in a document called Lessons Learned, but it's part of taking what we've learned and how can we get that information in the bidder's hands so that ultimately they can create a better proposal to get things across the finish line. So
well, were there any changes proposed to the systems integrator contract documents as a result of the Bearing Point failure?
I didn't go back and look at the actual contract in Bearing Point, so I'm not familiar with that, but I am familiar with the contract with SAP as a system integrator.
We'll get to that in just a second. But at the point where the Bearing Point systems integrator contract blew apart and Bearing Point was terminated, did the controller's office step back, and I'm not suggesting that you should have, but I'm just asking, did you step back and do an analysis as to whether the SAP off-the-shelf software was the thing to use, or whether we should maybe stop the process at that point and go with a customized product?
We didn't get far enough along with the system at that time to understand how it worked, and so there wouldn't be any lessons learned because we didn't get to the point where we were actually running the system.
So as I recall, and I was told, I mean, during this time, Bearing Point was under great financial duress. In fact, their stock, eventually was delisted when it went below $1. Has explained to me that every decision that Bearing Point was made was really through a financial prism of how do we get to a deliverable to get paid so that they could keep money going, and really not what was in the best interest of the state controller. And it's my understanding that's what led to the cure. And ultimately their demise, as they went bankrupt, they could not provide the resources required to meet their contractual obligations.
Well, I guess that's a point then we need to take a look at in terms of due diligence with respect to the financial capability and underpinnings of bidders in government contracts, and what standard we need to hold bidders to, and what performance bonds we need to expect bidders to provide when they're contracting with the state of California on projects of this magnitude. Okay, well, let's talk about the SAP systems integrator contract, because that's what you're most familiar with, right?
I am.
So at that point, Bearing Point had been terminated. We've got SAP as a software vendor. We need a systems integrator because we have to integrate and customize this thing that we are buying. What due diligence did we do with respect to SAP's experience as a systems integrator prior to the time we did the bake-off and entered into the contract?
So, and that was part of the procurement that I am familiar with. I wasn't here when it actually occurred, but I've gone back to those documents on several occasions. And they were vetted both as a company under their administrative qualifications, financials, just like everyone else would. And in accordance, I believe that they were probably 4 different categories of client references that they were required to provide. A large public sector, where they'd done something at least similar to the size of California, and they had produced a reference, I believe it was the state of Bavaria, that had clients or payroll in excess of 300,000. And through that vetting process, I mean, they met the criteria that was laid out in the procurement.
I mean, was this prior work the work of a systems integrator or the work of a software vendor? Do you recall?
Well, SAP Public Services was the legal bidding entity, and that work should have been their work.
But I mean, do we know in Bavaria, for example, whether they were simply providing their off-the-shelf software for customization, if it needed to be customized by somebody else, or whether they were actually doing the integration work necessary to field their product?
Yeah, they represented it as system integration work.
So when and again, I'm just looking at process improvement here. So when the vendor, in this case SAP, says I did the work in Bavaria, did anybody pick up the phone and call whoever you call in Bavaria to find out if they did systems integration work, or if they simply gave them a box with some software in it?
So I believe that the calls were made on all the client references where they got points. I mean, that's typically how it's done. Now, again, I wasn't part of that procurement, so I can't swear to that.
It's DGS, right?
DGS or the evaluation team.
Okay.
But typically, I mean, you go through that process, and you got 7 or 8 boxes that you go down and check, and that's how they score and allocate points.
Now, I think it was in the Senate Office of Oversight report. I could be wrong. It might have been one of the other ones. There was a reference to one of the controller's consultants delivering a warning that the SAP data migration tools appeared to be inadequate at or about the time of this SAP systems integrator contract discussion. Do you recall any of that?
I do recall that because I've spoken with those gentlemen about that a number of times, and I did speak to the Senate Oversight Committee as well, and I may have overstepped my bounds a little bit in describing that. When I went back and checked, and I corrected it in the meeting with the Senate Oversight Group, these consultants had voiced some concern not only about the tool but the process, and they wanted to take a deeper dive. Essentially, they wanted to go in and say, hey, can you tell us exactly how, using this tool, you'll be able to complete data migration to the 300,000 population eventually for the state of California. That deep dive was prevented with the lack of guidelines under 6611 at the time because DGS had indicated that they thought that might be viewed as, we're directing what products or services one of the bidders may need to provide, and that we're providing some sort of favoritism, and that ultimately that could jeopardize the integrity of the procurement. While there's no protest available under 6611, they certainly could file suit if they knew of something like that afterwards.
Well, do you know what the source of concern of these consultants was, having to do with SAP's data migration tool?
I believe it was the tool and the process they were looking at was they had question about it.
Do you know whether the concern was based in contact that these consultants had with prior customers of SAP?
I don't know if it was in contact with prior customers. The gentlemen that are the consultants, they know a lot about this. They have a lot of experience. They did say that it could be done with the tool that was proposed, and it was graded that way. It was pass or fail, and it was graded pass. But they did want to have further discussion, and they were precluded from having that.
And your recollection is that DGS prevented the controller's office from following the recommendations of your consultants? By the way, were these independent consultants? Who were these consultants?
They're independent consultants, and they're hired by us to consult on the project with specific SAP knowledge.
So this is the independent verification?
Oh, no, excuse me. These are consultants that are hired by SCO that work for us to advise us on the project. This is not the IPOC or the IVB.
So you informed DGS that your consultants had recommended this deeper dive, as you describe it?
That's my understanding. Again, I wasn't here at the time, but that's my understanding of what happened.
But that DGS prevented the agency from conducting further due diligence with respect to this particular contractor as a systems integrator?
That's my understanding, yes.
Was there any documentation that was supplied by DGS documenting this instruction?
I don't believe so.
Do you know whether or not the controller's personnel at the time who were involved in this issue made any sort of inquiry to other agencies or attorneys representing the state as to what was appropriate under the circumstances?
I don't believe that they did.
After receiving this information from the independent consultant, did the controller's office do anything differently with respect to the systems integrator procurement and SAP?
Well, they didn't go in and take the deep dive, so they just went through the process as DGS laid it out.
Were there any inquiries made of SAP regarding the data migration tool?
I don't believe outside of whatever normal discussion that they were having.
Now, moving on, my understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong because I wasn't here either, that in December of 2009, the LA Unified School District Inspector General issued a report regarding issues associated with SAP integration at the district. Is my recollection correct?
I'm not familiar with that report.
Not familiar with that report?
No.
After the Lessons Learned team visited LA Unified School District and the Community College District down there, were there any follow-on visits or contact, to your knowledge, with the district or the Unified School District regarding the implementation of the SAP software?
I am not aware of any follow-on contacts on that.
So SAP receives the systems integrator contract in about February of 2010, right?
That's correct.
And again, one of the reports that I had the privilege of spending time with indicates that at some point after that February 10 timeframe, 210 timeframe, there was an independent oversight consultant who began warning that SAP's testing was falling behind schedule. Do you recall whether or not the controller's office received those warnings?
I believe not only did they receive those warnings, they probably came from the project, and that the independent consultant was probably reiterating the issues and risks that were already known to the project. That was the typical process, and if you'd like, I'll spend a minute and kind of walk you.
Certainly, that would be helpful.
Okay, and I'm going to go back a little bit, so if it goes too far, just let me know. We operate large projects like this under a project management methodology, and it's very specific. It's the state has its own version of it. We follow the Project Management Institute in their book of knowledge, which is called PMBOK. This project methodology is really based in IEEE standards that go all the way back to NASA space stuff that people learned about projects and how to put them together. And this is a methodology that we follow. Our framework covers 9 components: risk management, issue management, schedule management, change control, document and deliverable management, status reporting, quality, requirements traceability management, and governance. And each one of these is a separate plan that walks us through what we do and how we do it. So when issues and risks arise, we document them, we prioritize them, we assign resources to them. If they don't move through the process, then they're escalated within our governance plan. So, we have teams where, we meet daily, and we have teams where the project management meets with the IVV and the IPOR representatives weekly, and the project management office meets weekly. Then we have an operational steering committee that meets every other week, and we go through all of these meetings, culminating in our monthly executive steering committee meeting. So as issues arise, either from IPOC or IVV or from the project, we share those in a weekly meeting. And then, we assign and we work issues that come up. For the most part, and you can tell in the documentation on an IPOR or an IVV report if the issue comes from the project by the way that the nomenclature and the numbering system that's used goes back to this methodology. For the most part, out of all the issues and risks that I've seen that have come up through IPOC or IVV are already noted and being managed by the project. There are some instances where they come up with new and unique stuff, and then we would have a discussion about it, and if the project believed that it was a significant risk, we would bring that into risk management and then manage it within our processes. So I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit of the framework about how this works.
Well, thank you. The documentation suggests that not only were these warnings coming up through your reporting process in 2010, but they continued in 2011 and 2012. So I guess the question that just pops into my little pea brain is what action was taken to improve the testing process or testing plan and deal with the testing schedule delays?
So again, if I could just have a minute, I'll try and walk you through that too. In testing, first off, I want to make it clear that the testing responsibility resided with SAP under the contract, and that's clear. In fact, Carlos Ramos was here before. He said, well, that's one of the areas where he believes that the contract is clear.
But we're not a passive participant in this process as an agency or the state, right? It's our job to monitor contract performance and spank where necessary.
It absolutely is, and I'll walk you through that process. So from 2010 to go live, we executed, I believe it was 26 separate tests and over 4,600 test scripts. A number of those tests are repetitive cycles. For example, payroll comparison 1, payroll comparison 2, payroll comparison 3. Same thing with our integration test, 1, 2, 3, and then the same thing with our interface test, 1, 2, 3. As we're working through the process, these things, we're looking at, and I'll take you through an example. Payroll comparison 1, that's a deliverable. There were so many issues and problems with that. That was rejected out of hand. It was tendered. It was not of the quality that was acceptable. It was pushed back. So issues and problems arise. They go into our management system. We track them. We work them. And then we incorporate those into the next test cycle. So when things are reported back in March of 2010, we very likely have worked on those issues, resolved the issues in those deliverables, and then moved forward. If at the end of that cycle of deliverables, that issue has not been resolved, it's incumbent upon not only the IPOC, the IVB, but our own project staff that are reviewing these to say, this does not meet the criteria for acceptance, we must reject the deliverable. And that's not the case. We take the whole contract and divide it up. And this one, at the end of the day, was divided into 159 separate deliverables. And the first part of that could be a project schedule, a plan, a test cycle, a blueprint validation. Those are the things. We define what they are. We assign resources to it. We say what's going to be done, how long it's going to be worked, and what is the acceptance criteria for this deliverable. Now, to the extent that we have problems and issues, we work those problems and issues and get them resolved before that deliverable is tendered. And at the end of the day, if that deliverable meets its acceptance criteria, we have to accept it. That's how we move on, and that's how we make progress on the project. Now, over time, over a year from 2010 to 2011, could the same issue pop up in testing? It could, and in fact it did. But it's not the same issue in the same test. These are issues that are recurring, they're being addressed, they're being worked in the deliverable, we're learning lessons, we're incorporating it, and if it meets the acceptance criteria, then we accept it, and then we move to the next set of deliverables.
Well, maybe it's semantics. Now, I wouldn't call what you described as a delay in the testing schedule, and your independent consultant called it a delay in the testing schedule. So is it just semantics, or were there delays in the testing schedule?
There was a delay, and that was early on. A delay in the testing schedule would have been driven by the fact that they couldn't do data migration because the test required the data to be migrated. And what happens is when you have a project schedule with hundreds of deliverables, they're all dependent on something happening, a precursor task, right? If that data migration doesn't happen, then it delays the test and everything else that's related to it. So I believe, and I have to go back and look at the specifics, but if he's saying that, the tests are delayed, they're likely delayed because we were at loggerheads trying to figure out data migration and how to get the data that was required to do that test. And
the reports indicate, they're somewhat consistent if I'm reading these reports accurately. In 2010, 2011, 2012, they talk about extensive delays or delays in testing. At any point in time between 2010, when SAP took on the system integrator contract, and the termination of the contract, were the testing delays ever remedied?
So I think you need to separate it out from the 2010 up to November 2011, when they were initially cured for data migration. Because what came out of that, the project's progressing, hit loggerheads, schedule goes off track because data migration didn't happen, the subsequent deliverables couldn't be delivered, almost at a project standstill, okay? Then that's cured, and a new schedule comes out at the end of November 2011.
We bring a new system integrator on, don't we?
No, we don't bring a new system integrator on. SAP brought in back office associates to complete the data migration, which they were unable to do.
Okay, so there were some other reports that I noticed in going through the documentation that independent oversight consultants expressed concerns about the lack of quality assurance protocols established inside the controller's office, if I read that correctly. And as early as 2006 in this protocol, or process. So perhaps you can address that for me and tell me if there's anything embedded in there that we need to focus on in terms of process improvement on a go-forward basis.
Well, I can tell you this just from experience, that You can always improve quality assurance processes. And again, I can't speak to the ones specifically in 2006. I can speak to the ones on this project with SAP. And one of the deliverables that we have in that project management methodology is a quality assurance plan. And it goes through, and SAP divides up what the responsibilities are. And I would say that SCO is meeting its responsibilities not only under the contract, but under this deliverable that defines what we're supposed to do in terms of quality assurance. I think there are many things that deliverable shows that SAP was responsible for that they did not provide.
Well, what sort of, do you know what the independent oversight consultants were talking about when they talk about quality assurance protocols inside the controller's operation? And if so, maybe you could describe it to me, because I'm not a computer person.
I can't tell you about the ones that they're specifically referencing there, but I can tell you from a quality assurance perspective, it was a distributed event, meaning that we've got folks that are responsible for functional requirements, folks that are responsible for data, folks that are responsible for change management, and so in their respective areas, they're responsible for reviewing and making sure that the documents and deliverables are of acceptable quality. In addition to that, we've got the project management office and that team reviewing them to ensure that they meet the requirements, the letter of the contract, and that they're of acceptable quality. There are a number of times where SAP quality assurance teams that were supposed to come in, and they came in either late or after the fact, and we weren't able to avail ourselves of the information that they provided because that quality assurance team came too late. Well,
and of course, this hearing is not to decide SAP versus the state of California. I'm focused internally. Did the controller's office at the time, specifically starting in 2006 and moving forward, have an internal written quality assurance protocol associated with this SAP procurement action?
I can't speak to 2006. I can tell you that 2010 forward, there's a quality assurance plan, and it's part of the deliverables for this project.
And that includes the controller's office personnel participating in that?
Yes. It divides responsibilities among and between SAP and SCO.
Well, one other issue that I noted when I reviewed these various documents that people provided to us was that apparently in February of 2011 there was an independent project oversight report that issued that again spoke about significant delays in the data conversion, which we've been hearing about.
Yes.
And you'd been hearing about at that point in time for some time. But the report also apparently noted that major state departments, CAL FIRE, the State Water Resources Control Board, Caltrans, were apparently significantly behind, and this is a quote, behind schedule and at serious risk of missing deadlines to develop interfaces to interact with the new system. Do you remember that, and what action was taken with respect to that issue, if any?
I don't recall that specifically. Again, that's before my time. But I can tell you that overall, we did have challenges in getting outside departments to step up to their interface work. And we drove that right down to go live in testing interfaces.
The report also indicates that there were 3 vacancies in critical positions. I didn't put it in my notes, but I assume within the controller's office. Is that a consistent issue that sort of plagued this SAP procurement process?
I don't believe so. And the reason that I can state that, fairly confidently is I believe that the SCO for the most part was staffed about 50% over what they had committed to in the proposal, what SAP had said was required from the state controller's office. So we were close to 150 positions instead of the 100 positions that we were told that would be required. And so even when we did have vacancies, and we did, people move off of projects, I think we dealt with them as best we could in trying to get those backfilled.
I guess for the same reason I made the comment earlier, and maybe it's because I don't understand the procurement process, and I certainly admit I do not understand IT issues. But I guess I'm again bothered by the fact that SAP is telling us how to staff. I mean, again, maybe I don't understand, but I would think that the organization doing the contracting should determine its own staffing levels necessary to measure, monitor performance of a contractor and determine whether the deliverable is on schedule or not. But again, I'm not an expert, and I depend on, to some extent, you all, as apparently we depended on SAP,
Right.
to tell me what the rules are.
And we do. We come up with our own staffing models, but we share that because we want to set expectations right on both sides. So here's the staff we're bringing to the table. Here's the staff you're bringing to the table. Is this the right staff, and do we have the right volume, right? So you have to work with them through the procurement process. It's just not them one-sided telling us what we need to do.
Well, now let me touch on another issue that's a little bothersome to me, although I wasn't here. Apparently, in February of 2011, the Comptroller's Office issued a written report to the legislature, which one of my predecessors, Senator Ducheney, had requested. And in this particular written report, if I read it properly, it indicated that this particular SAP project was making significant progress without any, I guess, further description of significant issues that you were experiencing with the SAP contractor at the time. Was there any reason why the issues with SAP were not more fully disclosed to the legislature at the time?
I think at that time, that report would cover the prior period. We were just starting to realize that we were having issues with data conversion at that time. I think they were reported in the next report that we were having significant challenges, and we expected a 6 to 12 month delay.
Well, actually, it may not be the next report, so you may actually be right. I will defer to you on that. But there was certainly one in April of 2011 that was submitted to the legislature where the Comptroller's Office characterized the data conversion issues as, and this is apparently a quote, largely contained.
So, Senator, I know that the report that I looked at, I believe we specified to the legislature that we were having significant problems with data conversion, and we expected a 6 to 12 month delay.
I think at that time, because I did look at that report, I think in the report that was published, it indicated that IPOC said, no, there was 9 high-risk issues or items. Those items actually came from the project. They weren't IPOC specific. And if you trace those through, those items that IPOC was reporting on reported to our executive steering committee and, in fact, are reported in that April 2011 report.
So just so I'm clear, I mean, do you believe that the legislature was red flagged on these data conversion issues as early as February, March, April of 2011?
Yes, Senator, if I can talk a little bit about our legislative kind of communication process that we have. We had, of course, you recognize that we submitted these quarterly reports to the legislature, and those included overview, key accomplishments, vital signs, risk management, and identified the issues that were faced with that. We also, Senator, included if you will, a briefing with ledge staff to walk them through the issues that we were facing on the project at the time, and we would raise these issues and discuss the issues that we had. In 2011, we had 5 formal briefings with staff, and in 2012 we had 4. We provide, as I said, a lot of color and texture to what was happening on the project at the time. And in addition, we provided those because those quarterly reports were in the rears, and they covered a prior period. So in addition to that, as the LAO indicated, we met with them over a 2-year period over 40 times. We believe that we provided good information to the legislature. I think that, some staff at the LAO reported at a hearing that communication has been pretty transparent and very good. And not only with the legislative side, but also with the departments, because they've done a lot of demos and road shows. So I would characterize our communication plan with the legislature as good. If I think if you have concerns with that, Senator, we'd really like to work with you to work on our communication plan so that doesn't happen again.
Well, and of course, my purpose is, I wasn't here.
Yeah.
But my purpose is to make sure that we sort of explore process improvement and we don't have a cool hand Luke moment and a failure to communicate. So, I mean, I think that Senator Ducheney's letter was pretty clear about written reports, and in fact, written reports were submitted, and I think on a go-forward basis, we just need to make sure that the written reports, which are likely reports that are going to be read by people like me, are fully explanatory and cover the essential points. Eclipse Solutions was an independent verification and validation consultant.
Correct.
So my review of all of this material, or most of it, indicates that in April of 2011, Eclipse issued an assessment citing, and this is April 2011, when apparently the data conversion issues were largely contained. But Eclipse cites critical discrepancies, including inaccurate mappings, incomplete conversion cycles, lack of focus and priority, and a bunch of other stuff. Do you recall receiving this Eclipse Solutions report, and if so, what action did we take?
I wasn't here. I've seen the report. In fact, I was looking at it last night. The actions that were taken after that were, I believe at the time, they were looking at two vendors, at Utopia and Back Office Associates, in order to find out who could resolve this data migration issue. And I think that was noted in the reports. And just one last thing. I mean, Jim had addressed the lag in the reports. I think if you look at the date on the letter that went over on that JLBC report, even though it says April for the deck itself, I think that went over in late May. So by the time that we're actually looking at that report and what's going on, Utopia and Back Office are in here, and we're in discussion. So I think from the project's perspective, things are being resolved.
So I guess in terms of process improvement, if in fact communication is requested and that's the object, we're going to have to work on the timeliness of it. If we're getting data that's late over here in this building, that's not particularly useful to us in terms of helping you help the state. So it looks like August 19, 2011 on my timeline, about 4 months later after the 4 or 3 or 5 months later after Eclipse Solution, depending on exactly what date we're talking about, you all issued a cure notice to SAP, having to do with the failure to achieve the data conversion objectives that you put in place, right? I was bothered by learning that apparently a few days later, about 6 to be specific, on August 25, 2011, there was some testimony to the Little Hoover Commission by, I believe, Controller's Office personnel having to do with this particular project, indicating that it was proceeding as planned, and there was no reference to any cure letter. There was no reference to any data conversion failure on the part of SAP, and no indication that this train was about to roll off the tracks again. Any?
Yes, Senator, I'd like to address that and how we kept the legislature informed during that critical period of the project. We had, as I indicated, and as you referenced, we begin in the spring and summer identifying the issues with data conversion and identifying that there was a 6 to 12 month delay. In early mid-August, we held briefings with the ledge staff again on our quarterly report and identifying the issues that we were having and the struggles with data conversion. And in fact, Senator, we indicated to staff that we were considering all of our options at that time, which would include issuing a cure notice. We issued the cure notice on August 19th, and SAP responded on Sunday August 21st, indicating they would bring in back office associates to do the data conversion, and essentially the issue was nearly resolved. It was only days later that we briefed the LAO on the cure notice, and we held a special briefing for staff in September to identify, the cure notice and the settlement. So through all of those briefings, Senator, we believe we kept the legislature informed of the issues related to that cure notice.
And in fact, my review indicates that I don't have a specific date, but sometime in September of 2011, there was a written report to the legislature that cited data conversion as a problem in this project.
Yeah.
So just a basic question. Internally in the Controller's office, during this period of time when reports were being generated and sent over here, who made the decision what to report and when to report it with respect to this project? Anybody want to take that one?
The report was generally prepared by our staff on the project. We included a PowerPoint presentation that would identify the issues, the risks, the vital signs, risk management, and we would also include a cover letter on that outlined the issues that were going, the issues we were facing with the project at the time.
So, and who made the decision to release that product after it was prepared?
It was reviewed by our executive office.
Okay, and so that's where the decision was made in terms of what to report and when to report?
The information that was contained in the report was, a lot of that was provided by the project management staff on the project.
That's essentially rolled up. I was telling you before about the governance from the weekly to the weekly, and then to our operational steering committee, and then input from IVV and IPOC at our executive steering committee, and then we roll that up, and that's essentially the basis for the report that comes out.
So the reports are prepared, they're rolled up, they're sent to the executive office, and the executive office decides what to report and when to report it, and then sends a report over here.
Yes.
Okay. So talk to me a little bit about, we've touched on, and I forget the name of the company, but we have a new data conversion operator who joins the team.
Back office associates.
Back office assistants, right?
Associates,
we need plenty of those. And that's November of 2011, right? And who selected back office associates?
Well, SAP selected it, but it was really at the prodding of the SEO.
Is that a contract that's between SAP and back office associates?
It is.
So we're not involved, as the state of California, we're not involved at that point.
We're not involved. There were two vendors that were involved, and SEO did spend some time. You were asking earlier about vetting, right? So when someone was going to come in, we had done additional vetting. We did not like the Utopia company that SAP was proposing, and strongly recommended that they bring in back office associates, and they did that at our request.
Under the contract that was in play at the time, did the state have the authority to reject the proposed subcontractor and demand another one be selected?
I'd have to go back and look at it. I believe under the general terms and conditions they probably did, but better to resolve it up front and let them know why, and get the right vendor in here. And They did do that.
Okay. Now, I want to shift focus at this point and talk about organizational change and training, and in this case, someone refers to a knowledge transfer. Mm-hmm. And there was apparently a February 2012 independent project oversight report that references knowledge transfer and talks about the fact that the project, quote unquote, had stopped monitoring progress in terms of knowledge transfer, the training necessary to enable state workers to take over the operation of the system. So I assume by the project we're talking about Controller's Office personnel, if it's true.
Well, the project typically refers to the combined SCO-SAP project.
So in that particular case and during that particular time frame, who had the responsibility for monitoring the the progress and the success or failure of the knowledge transfer enterprise vis-a-vis state employees?
I'd have to go back and look at the specific statement of work, but I'm relatively sure that the monitoring of it is an SAP requirement under the statement of work.
Do you recall, as the Controller's Office, receiving that report regarding the lack of monitoring of knowledge transfer?
Not personally, but it was known on the project that, and this is not atypical of a large project, that knowledge transfer of all the things that, if something is going to slip, it's typically knowledge transfer. I'm not professing that that's a good thing, but it does happen.
But you recall that being an issue at or about that time?
I don't know about the time of that, sir, but I do recall during my tenure there as it being an issue.
Now, I guess my follow-up question is what action was taken? Because I assume knowledge transfer is a pretty important piece of the rollout of a new IT payroll system.
So it is an important piece, and let me explain. What we did is we assigned someone from the SEO side to go back and track who had done what, and it took a while to get going, but we were doing what SEO was required under the contract to do to get the knowledge transfer, to get it back on track. Now, what I can tell you, though, is knowledge transfer, as important as it sounds, is not so important when you're building the system as it is when you go to maintain the system at the end. And let me explain that a little bit. When your vendor and your contractor is here with you, we've got this 15, 18-month window where we're going through standing up Pilot 1, Pilot 2, Wave 3, 4, and 5. It's when you're on your own, right, that you need to be able to know everything about that to maintain it. So knowledge transfer, and again, that's typically why these things slip. Again, I'm not professing that that's a good thing. I'm just saying that it does happen, and there's time to make that up. And what you need to make sure is before your vendor is going to leave, that all of that knowledge transfer has been transferred.
Some of the reports indicate that, and the email traffic, and you've probably seen it, that there was a reluctance among the controller's staff to participate in these knowledge transfer training programs. And one in particular that I happened to see, dated May 2 of 2012, from a Lisa Dean, who I assume is a controller's office employee. And this is a quote: "One participant slept quite a bit, one participant very frustrated, not willing to try and learn. I'm at a loss for the lack of respect being shown in class." I also spotted as early as 2005, July, independent project oversight report that warns about the need for organizational change if this large project is to be successful. So I guess my questions are, what action internally did the Controller's Office take to try to bring employees along, or in the alternative, administer appropriate corrective action for those employees who were not fully on board with this change, whether it's a sea change or not, but change in the way the Controller's Office was going to do business vis-a-vis payroll?
So thank you for the opportunity. I'd really like to illuminate this subject a little bit, and I am familiar with the May 2nd email. And in fact, I think you only have a portion of that email. If you have the entire email, I would request that you go ahead and pull it out.
It's probably true. We only sometimes have a portion of things.
Right. I think what you'd find in reviewing that entire email is that some of the folks were frustrated, tired, and maybe nodding off because this was a session that they had covered before, and it was hours in. And let me explain a little bit about the training that these folks were going to. And this was our change management group led by SAP and their supposed best practices. Going into this training, they had scheduled our folks in HR for 172 hours of training. And they claimed that this was best practice. I challenged them on that, and I asked them to show me another project where they had done that, and they could not. We were driving our HR folks 4 days a week through computer training, 4 days straight through, And then on Friday, they got to do their regular job. That continued for over 5 weeks straight. At the end of it, I mean, I would have been frustrated myself. This was something that we took issue with, and in fact, we cured them as a result of this, because we said, look, the training was ineffective giving them that much. Anybody can only absorb so much along the way. And to provide 172 hours of straight training, it didn't accomplish the task. And we wanted to make sure that before we went into Pilot 2 and brought another 10,000 employees in 7 or 8 departments into this, that we sure had a training program that folks could get through so that they'd know how to do their job at the end of the day.
And were these people being trained for something that was going to occur in the future, or was this training necessary for the implementation and rollout of the MyCalPAYS system?
So it was training for the implementation of MyCalPay. So they were training what they call just-in-time training, right? You're getting trained just before you get it. And in fact, if you don't complete the training, you don't get access to the system to be able to do your work.
Were they involved in the data? Were these people that we've been talking about here involved in the data conversion process?
No, they weren't.
Okay. Were they involved in any of the problem issues associated with this SAP procurement effort?
No,
These are our human resources staff that actually do the payroll for our office.
I see. So they were going to be doing something at a future date.
These are users of the system.
I see.
The ones that would be entering my time, Jim's time.
They got trained in May, and they went live with the system in June.
I see. So we're training people who are going to ultimately work the system once the switch is flipped and the system is on, at the same time that we're doing the data conversion and the other systems integration effort. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
And I can tell you just one more tidbit that I'd like to add. As a result of that, I sporadically would walk into these training sessions unannounced. I did not find that. I'm not challenging what was reported in there. Lisa Dean ultimately works for me. But what I'm saying is I'd been in other training sessions, and I did not find that to be the case.
Okay. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to something else, and something in March of 2012. There was a independent project oversight report issued around that time, March 6, I think, 2012, that warned that lack of quality in testing may result in MyCalPAYS errors and an employee's not receiving correct pay, if I copied the quote right. And at or about that time, there was an oversight report from a consultant that once again warned that there was no formal quality assurance practice or quality assurance team. I don't know if you recall those.
I do, at a high level.
And then this goes to my question. I'm looking at a scorecard that I was provided, and perhaps you can provide me some guidance on this one. Project scorecard is of March 31st, 2012, which is right about the same time, and it has these greens and reds and yellows, which
yes.
We're familiar with.
Yes, I am.
And out of 15 categories, 14 of them are green. And I don't know what these categories, these vital signs really are talking about, but there's one that sort of jumped out at me and compels an explanation. Technology viability, which I would think goes to whether it works, but I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. And that's listed as strong in green. And then there's another one that talks about vendor viability, which I assume is either SAP or whatever the associates.
That would be SAP at that point, yeah.
And that's also listed as strong and green. So
yes.
Who prepared this, and where did it go?
Okay.
Is, I guess, my question.
That project scorecard is prepared by the project for the technology agency. And the underlying categories and the rules in which, you have to give it a 1, 2, or 3, or 0, or whatever, are not designed by the project. It's a quantitative measure to kind of get an overall kind of stoplight reporting dashboard, okay? I too, had taken issue with that and said, wait a minute. the vital sign on the vendor here is green, and I'm not so sure that that's it. And what I got from my project management office was, well, here's the rules in which you make it green, red, or yellow, right? And so we follow the rules. And I'm here to tell you that we have a lot of dashboards, a lot of project dashboards. A lot of times you see stuff red, green, yellow. What does it all mean? Many times it's inconsistent. Many times you'll see things that are flashing red because a single deliverable is behind schedule. That may be behind schedule by a day or a week or something like that. But in a project plan that's 5,000 line items deep, I don't get credit for the other 432 that are above schedule, right? I mean, so these things are really, in my mind, they're subjective, they're dashboards, they're intended to give the reader, hey, there's potentially something going on here, take a look. It's not necessarily, you see red, you should be stopped. And I think, if you want to look at something that could be corrected in the future, could be standardized, I think that would be a great service, not only to the legislature, but to all of the oversight bodies. For all of California's large IT projects, if that kind of reporting were standardized and meaningful, so that if you did, because stoplight reporting, it intends to give you this red light, green light. So if it's red, then why aren't you stopped? Let's make it that way. And if it's orange, we should be cautious, or yellow. But let's make it what people, think that it really means and make it standard. I think that could be extremely helpful.
Well, one thing, certainly is true. If in fact, embedded inside these 15 or so vital signs, there are numerous subcategories, there needs to be some weighting process associated with it. So if 43 out of 44 are good and 44 is bad, but 44 is insignificant, maybe it's green, but if 44 is fairly significant, maybe it's something other than green. So exactly. I guess as a takeaway, we ought to take a look at how we're doing our scoreboard.
And I think I don't know if we'll have the opportunity to get to it, when you look at what we call our MRTLs, our master readiness task list, it's a checklist to go live, right? It's the same situation. We tracked over 312 items, and there are many subcategories in there, but they're not necessarily weighted, right? And you could have, something, a showstopper, and maybe just one item, but you got 99% of them green. What do you do in that situation? So I agree with you, Senator.
So in March of 2012, we put some more money in this, and we pushed the completion date back to September 2013. And in going through these various reports, there was an oversight report, again, submitted to the Controller's Office by your consultant, and I'll mess up this name, but Chai Emoti?
Very close, yes. Chi Emoti.
Sorry, apologize. I guess in April 2012, that if I got the quote right, employee survey clearly shows most of the functional team members have not attended the SAP training courses. Maybe that applies to your prior testimony.
It actually does. I mean, the functional team, well, they're required to attend these courses. These are the ones that are actually doing configuration on the project. And so they already have, just by the nature of working side by side with SAP and completing the work, they have pretty in-depth knowledge of the system, at least in certain particular areas where they're tasked.
Okay, let's focus back on reporting to the legislature. 5 months or so before we start getting into the cure notice conversation with SAP, there's a report submitted to us in April of 2012, a written report that notes data conversion was working well and project was on track for the first pilot, creating actual paychecks for 1,300 SCO employees beginning June of 2012. So that's what the legislature apparently knew in April of 2012. Was the project on track then?
And I was there then, and I can tell you that the project was madly on track. We were working overtime and weekends. We were meeting our schedules. We actually had 5 contingency days, meaning we could deliver 5 days early at that point in time. So, again, when I'm talking about deliverables, we're meeting them. They're meeting our acceptance criteria. We're working forward. We're going to make this go live. But we are also considering the many, many things that we have to do to ensure that we're ready to go live. And those are our master readiness task list. Again, 11 entities, special business partners, SEO divisions, stakeholders in the project that have been tracking readiness tasks for well over a year. 312 of those, and all of them but 2 were green. We had 2 red ones, and they were at CalPERS. One had to deal with an interface, and one had to deal with getting their PCs ready to go. They gave us conditional approval. They said, go forward with this small population. We don't have any concern. Just make sure that those fixes are in place before you go to pilot 2.
Now, you ran your first pilot on June 11, 2012?
That's when we brought the system live, correct.
When did it become clear that there was a problem with the system run?
So let me differentiate a little bit. The system went live June 11th, and we ran the first payroll effective July 1st. It was mid-July. I mean, we went into pilot, we knew we'd have some errors. I mean, that's the purpose of a pilot. People, process, technology. Find out what it is, shake it out. I can recall, and I'm quoted in the minutes of our executive steering committee meeting saying, look, we are going to find problems in pilot 1. Don't worry about the problems that we find. What you should be concerned about is our ability to respond to them and fix them. That's what's critical. So we started finding errors in early July. By the end of July, we were at a heightened alert stage, far more than was ever anticipated. We called SAP executives into my office and asked them why, and they couldn't explain it. And that gave us no level of comfort whatsoever. They couldn't tell us why we were getting these errors, how many, what was the cause of it. They couldn't fix them. And then they agreed by August 3rd, I believe was a Friday, we were on the phone to the East Coast, top to top with their executives, and they agreed to bring in their escalation team, which is a red team, to come in here and assess, what went wrong and how to get it back on track. And we worked with them from August 6th all through the summer trying to get this fixed. And there were 3 things that we required of them. Number 1, and they agreed, number 1 priority was stabilize payroll. Number 2, because they'd failed in part of the performance test, they had to prove that this design was scalable to the entire California population. And number 3, take the recommendations and the solutions from their red team and incorporate those into a corrective action plan so that we could go forward. And they couldn't do any of them.
Did they submit a corrective action plan?
They submitted several corrective action plans, but they were deficient. And most of the time, they did not contain what we required. For example, I shared with you the training strategy. They were willing to go forward into Pilot 2 with the same failed training strategy, 172 hours, and folks not being able to operate the system. That was just unacceptable. And for many areas, what they included was not the resolution of the issue. They put in time to do analysis to figure out what the problem was. Well, when you're driving a project team to a schedule, you got to have the task fully laid out, what that duration is, how long it takes, and the resources allocated to it. What happens is you'll get there, there'll be no time to do the analysis, or you'll do the analysis, and there's no time to implement the solution. And it would get pushed off, and we knew that. They failed on their first plan, they failed on their second plan. We were not going to take a plan that wasn't fully baked and ready to go.
There's a difference between not having people who are qualified to operate the system and having a system that doesn't work.
Right, and this system didn't work.
So, did you consider having SAP run a simulated parallel payroll to compare the results of that with the existing payroll from the legacy system?
Well,
and if so, why wasn't it done? And if not, why didn't we?
Okay, so I would like to address that. I'm going to find my notes here. So we tried to after the fact, and they wouldn't. So parallel testing is not within what they call their ASAP, their accelerated SAP methodology. And so what they do use is a comparison test, payroll comparison. Now, parallel payroll testing or payroll comparison testing, either one, The object is to ensure the accuracy of the payroll, okay? Now, there's no data that I know that's available that demonstrates that parallel testing is more accurate than comparison testing. And again, this is their methodology. This is what they came in and said they could do. This is what they bid. So in a comparison test, rather than run data through two live systems simultaneously and compare the result, you take data, point-in-time data, you extract it from the system, you run it through the new system, and then you compare it with the results of the existing system. That's what they did, and that was their methodology. Now, again, the first one failed. We learned lessons from that. We rejected that deliverable. We incorporated those lessons learned into payroll comparison 2. That was acceptable. We still learned some lessons. Those were incorporated in payroll comparison 3. At the end of the day, SAP assured us that outside of known differences, our payroll would be accurate within $1. And our IVV and IPOC reviewed that along with everyone else on the team. And the IVV comment at the end of the day is they have no significant findings with that deliverable. And that's really what set the stage in our expectation, because they made the assertion and told us that our payroll would be accurate within $1.
Well, then the train fell off the tracks. And in October of 2012, I guess on the 25th, they get a cure notice, they being SAP. And I was intrigued by, apparently in the cure notice, correct me if I'm wrong, SAP was asked to identify an SAP client where 191,000 employees were successfully processed in a single payroll area using SAP software. It's a good question. Was this the first time that SAP was asked a question?
No, not at all, Senator. And let me address and try and illuminate why that question is asked in a cure letter. So we qualified SAP at the outset of this through the procurement. Had they delivered payroll to someone with employees of excess of 300,000? And the answer to that is they can do that. What we're talking about here
That wasn't quite the answer to the question you asked, right?
Pardon me?
And that wasn't exactly the full answer to the question you asked, right?
No.
Have you done it? We can do it.
Yes.
That's two answers, different questions, right?
Correct.
Okay.
The reason we asked this question is after they looked at our requirements, they designed the system. So when we're procuring, the system is not designed. It's just a concept that we're talking about, right? At some point, you have to actually configure it and design it. Now, the largest pay area, what we call is pay frequency, call it that, in the state of California, is monthly payroll. That's approximately 191,000 individuals. The way that they designed the system was that would reside in one technical area within the system. So we know it'll do 300,000, and they've done it before. We need to know specifically, can it do it in this pay area, right? Because that is a challenge, and we knew it was a challenge, and we thought they were stretching it, and we asked them to validate it. Part of the reason that that's in there is we had a performance test set up. They only got halfway through the performance test and they failed. We split that deliverable. That performance test showed that they could handle Pilot 1, Pilot 2, and Wave 3 volumes. So we were okay to go into Pilot 1. But before we went to Pilot 2, they had to complete that performance test and show that the system was scalable to the entire population. The reason we're asking that question is we asked it numerous times. Show us where you've got a client where you've got 190,000 employees in one pay area, because we feared at that point that they didn't and that the design was not scalable.
Did you ever get an answer to that question?
We never got an answer to that. They answered every which way, but directly to that answer. We've got clients with this, we've got 1 million here, we've got there, we do it all over the world. They never answered that question specifically.
And we would have needed to know whether we had to split that population in order to run it in two different groups, essentially.
Okay. Well, let's sort of start talking about the way forward and the Controller's Office self-assessment or independent assessment. There's been some conversation about whether the state could or should simplify and or modernize its payroll practices. Was that question ever broached, discussed, or debated at any point in time during this SAP procurement experience?
It was. Again, I wasn't here during that time. That's known as blueprint validation is what the term for it. And during the blueprint validation phase, they bring in their expert consultants, and we bring in all our people that are familiar with the state's business requirements. And that's when the rubber really hits the road in terms of, can you meet this requirement with standard functionality or not? And there were a number of assumptions made that didn't prove true. So the state controller's office, where they could, made a number of business process changes to do business differently. But there are some areas where they're either barred by statute or collective bargaining, or it would be against good public policy to make such a change.
Well, we need to, by the way, I don't mean to interrupt, I'll let you finish, it's rude, but before I forget my thought, we need to identify those, and we need to identify them with some specificity as part of this process. So folks, perhaps brighter than I am, can decide whether or not this is something we need to explore, because we can't, there's no reason to continue to do business the way we did business in the 19th century if there's a modern and simplified way to do it that's going to result in less expense to the public and a more efficient operation for our employees. So,
well, we completely agree, and that should be part of an assessment going forward, looking at what can change and can the state really take on that level of change. But yes, we looked at those, and that was part of that blueprint validation process. So, but to contrast that with what Carlos Ramos was explaining earlier, I think all projects should really look at that far in advance before you do a procurement.
well, talk to me a little bit about maybe the self-assessment that's not buried in the preliminary internal review. You know, as you sit here today, and without getting into who's right and who's wrong in this contract dispute that's going on, as you look internally at the controller's office, were there things that could have been done better? Processes that could have been clearer? For example, do you believe, and we spoke about your oversight groups, do you feel that your oversight groups functioned effectively? The executive steering committee, the independent validation and verification consultant, the independent project oversight consultant. Did that process provide the kind of information necessary, perhaps even critical, to the controller and the executive team to make decisions at the right time and in the right way as it relates to this project?
I'll share. I've been on a number of projects in my time, and you know, we had very tight procedures here and very strong project management discipline, which really dictates, you know, how you do all of this. And I think we had excellent coordination with our IVB and the IPOC consultant. Again, our project managers met with them weekly. We had an all-hands meeting every day going on. We had our operational steering committee meeting weekly, our project leadership team. All of those led up to our executive steering committee. And IVB and IPOC were part of that king. I mean, they had unfettered access to the project, to meetings, documentation, whatever they want. And when they came forward to that executive steering committee, that wasn't filtered by the project. They brought whatever issues they thought were significant forward, and we addressed them right there. So I think we did have good procedures and good processes in place. Communication is always an area, and you've touched on this already, Senator. It's always an area that you can do better, and I'm sure that we could do better in that area.
So I'd like to add, these large projects are very challenging, and the state, for its construction projects, has what's called the State Public Works Board, and that board monitors the cost and scope of these projects. It may be something that the state wants to consider as some type of entity that looks at these projects and take your folks from like Franchise Tax Board, people at the exchange, and folks that have experience in managing these large projects, and have them assist in managing the portfolio for the state. So I think that's something that we've talked about in the future, or talked about previously, and think it's something the state should look at in the future.
Well, the size of our projects is not likely to get smaller. So we need to get better.
Yes.
So focusing on the oversight, do you believe that the independent project oversight reports, based on what we've been talking about today, were acted on appropriately and on a timely basis?
I do. If you've got the full complement of information and you know that we were working together on this, it's difficult when you go back and look at a forensic document and all you have are the bullets on the page. See, I'm aware of the process. I know what the exchange was, right? So I'm confident that the process was working. They were identifying those issues. We were working them. Some of them we needed to get SAP to work on. And I'm confident that if you brought in the IPOC or the IBV, they would share that same thought.
Well, what about the legislature? Do you believe, based on what we've reviewed today, that the legislature was properly and timely informed on the status of this project?
I think our documentation did that, yes.
Yeah, I think the quarterly reports that we had, those meetings, we had touch points with the Legislative Analyst's Office for transparency purposes, every 2 weeks. So, we think it was a good process. Again, we'd like to work with you to improve it going forward.
Well, and of course, others will judge all of us on that subject, but the public contract code provisions, we've touched on those. I confess I'm still a bit confused as to what changes we need to make, because the contract code and guidance was in place at least in 2004, 2005. Perhaps the folks that were involved in this procurement were not as informed on the sections as they could have been. Perhaps there were other issues, but we need to take a look at that. And if, in fact, we identify structural changes to the contract code that need to be made, we're committed here in the legislature to partner with the administration and government agencies, I know, to make those changes so that we can avoid situations such as this SAP procurement issue and the money that was involved. This carrot and stick incentive that I believe you all referenced in your report is important. We need to take a look at that. I would be interested in your specific recommendations beyond performance bonds to see what we need to put in place to enable agencies to effectively procure goods and services. It's still going to require agencies to effectively and efficiently monitor the performance of contractors and, of course, not defer to the contractor to tell us what we need to do and how we need to staff. But I'm certain you recognize that as well. I think what we'll do at this point is, unless you have anything else to say to the committee on the record, I think what we'll do at this point is adjourn for today to have this hearing reconvene at a date to be noticed in the file in the future. We have yet to get to the task force on re-engineering IT procurement for success, so to the extent that we have the chair here or any members of that task force, I appreciate your patience. We got a late start. I do want to give you an adequate amount of time to go through the task force report. Perhaps the controller and his representatives could be present as well, so we can have a discussion about the way forward here with respect to recommendations and improvements in the procurement process. And when we reconvene, we will have an opportunity for public comment at that time. So with that, we're adjourned for today at 3:15 p.m. I want to thank all of you for your participation. I want to thank you for your testimony and for working with us as a legislature to improve this process.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.